Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Saturday, February 8th, day 491 of the war. Amanda Borcel-Dan here with our military reporter Emmanuel Fabian for a special hostage release update. Thanks for joining me, Manny.
Hi, Amanda.
Today, 16 months into the war, 3 emaciated Israeli hostages were released in a humiliating ceremony in Gaza's Deir al-Balak Hamas stronghold. Manny will describe the release and update us on the status of the 3 men, Eli Sharabi, Or Levy, and Ohad Ben Ami. We will also learn about recent IDF operations on the ground in Gaza and what is happening in other hotspots, including the West Bank. All this and much, much more when we're back. Eli Sharabi, 52, Or Levy, 34, and Ohad Ben Ami, 56, are back home in Israel after 491 days of captivity. Eli Sharabi was kidnapped from Kibbutz Be'eri when Hamas terrorists rampaged through southern Israel on October 7, 2023. His wife and daughters were murdered in their home's safe room, and he and his brother Yossi were taken captive. His brother Yossi has since been confirmed dead, and Hamas is holding Yossi's body. Or Levy, 34, was kidnapped from the Supernova rave near Kibbutz Re'im on October 7th. His wife Eynav was killed, and their now 3-year-old son, Almog, has been staying with his grandparents ever since. Ohad Ben Ami was kidnapped from Be'eri. His wife Raz Ben Ami was also abducted and released as part of a week-long ceasefire in November 2023. Their daughters campaigned hard for their freedom. The men today are gaunt, needed support to walk, and were obviously starved. They, of course, evoked images of the liberation of Auschwitz 80 years ago last month. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said in response that their shocking appearances would not go unaddressed. Manny, how would you describe the men's health status right now, as far as you know?
I would say the only good news here is that the IDF hasn't taken them for emergency medical care. The hospitals in southern Israel, Soroka in Beersheba and Barzilai in Ashkelon, had prepared for release hostages who require urgent medical care. And in those cases, the army would have taken them straight to those hospitals to be treated. In the case of the 3 who were released today, they were taken to the army facility near Re'im, like all the previous releases in the last few weeks. They'll undergo an initial assessment there, and then they'll be taken to hospitals in central Israel. So while they, of course, look absolutely terrible, they are in fit enough condition to stay at the initial facility for a short while and meet with their family and undergo an initial assessment, and then be taken to hospitals in central Israel for care there, and they'll remain there for as long as required. The previous hostages that were released remained in hospitals in central Israel for about a week, sometimes a little bit more.
Manny, before we talk about the ceremony, where was it? It was in Deir al-Balak. And what do you think that this symbolizes to Hamas?
I'm not sure if it symbolizes much to Hamas, but what we have seen with these previous releases and in today's as well is Hamas usually releases the hostages in areas where they are being held. So we saw releases in Gaza City, we saw releases in Jabalia, we saw in Khan Yunis, and Deir al-Balak is one of the few areas of Gaza where the IDF did not operate in on the ground, or very limited operations in that area, not a full ground maneuver as we've seen in other areas of Gaza. And the reason for the army not carrying out major offensives in those areas is because Hamas holding many of the hostages there. So these 3 hostages were likely held in Deir al-Balak. The army didn't operate there because of the danger that the ground offensive can cause. Hamas has executed hostages when troops arrive. We've seen cases where the army has mistakenly killed hostages because of its activity. So really this shows that they were held in this area. What is, I would say, slightly surprising is the condition that they're in. They seem to, at least in my eyes and what many people have been saying, that they look like they've been starved. And Deir al-Balak is actually part of the humanitarian zone where most of the aid going to Gaza was heading. It's not like northern Gaza, which was kind of cut off at times and massive destruction there. they were being held in an area which is largely avoided the war. It wasn't hit by many airstrikes. Troops didn't operate there on the ground, and still these hostages seem to be in a very bad health condition. So that just shows that Hamas clearly wasn't looking after these hostages properly during their captivity.
Let's talk about the ceremony. And there was a huge poster in 3 languages behind the 3 hostages and some 8 gunmen. It said, "We're the flood, the war's next day," I suppose, shoring up Hamas's stronghold or hold on the Gaza Strip. And the ceremony was unique this time in that the men were forced to speak. And most of Israeli media has not actually screened the actual speeches. But what was the gist as far as you understood? And did you have the impression that the men actually knew what had happened to their families?
We don't know yet if the men if they know that in 2 of their cases their wives have been killed and their children have been killed. We don't know if they know these things yet. I'm sure they will find out more once they're back. But in this case, Hamas made them speak. They thanked Hamas for their stay and thanked them for giving them food and water. I haven't seen this sort of thing done by Hamas before on stage, but we've seen Hamas propaganda videos released afterwards, following the release of the hostages in recent weeks, where they filmed them beforehand thanking Hamas. Obviously, Hamas has told them what to say and told them to smile and say these things. So very similarly, I think, here with in the previous releases, we saw them waving and smiling. Here they made them speak for a minute or 2, each of them. It was almost like an interview with one of these Hamas gunmen, sort of asking them the questions and them answering. Israeli media, of course, did not broadcast the audio from these. They were speaking in Hebrew, but very, very cynical. And I think we've kind of almost gotten used to these Hamas parades and sort of show that they put on every week. But still, this time was shocking. It was very uncomfortable to watch, especially with the condition that the men are in. And that's something the media as well, but also the public, need to prepare for in the future weeks. I don't think it's going to be any easier in the future weeks. I think we're going to see more hostages in this sort of this condition, and later on in the final weeks of the releases, we're going to see as well bodies being released by Hamas. I'm not sure how Hamas is going to put on a show with that, but I'd rather not really imagine that.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. Today, Israel is expected to free 183 Palestinians in exchange for the release of the 3 hostages, including 18 who have been serving life sentences, 54 serving long sentences, and 111 who are detained while IDF operated in the Gaza Strip during the war. At recording time, this has not happened, and it's possible there will be a delay due to the terrible state of the hostages. We'll find out. But we're hearing that about 30 of the hostages in captivity still in the Gaza Strip are estimated to still be alive, and 70% of the Israeli public is in favor of continuing to the second phase of the hostage release and ceasefire deal with Hamas, according to a poll that aired last night. And they also found that a nearly identical figure backs U.S. President Donald Trump's proposal to relocate Palestinians outside the Gaza Strip. So just to remind our listeners, Phase 2 would see the release of around 24 living male hostages and some 35 dead hostages in return for the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire in the war that, of course, Hamas sparked on October 7th, 2023. Some now are speaking instead of a full Phase 2, but there would be instead some kind of Phase 1B. We obviously don't know about that right now. And in the meantime, Manny, there are still some IDF operations in Gaza. So what has been happening in the past week or so since we've spoken?
Mainly the army is maintaining the ground that it's holding in Gaza, in the Philadelphia corridor, in the Egypt-Gaza border area, and sort of an entire buffer zone along the border between Israel and Gaza. It's around 1 kilometer, slightly less in certain areas. So the army has been operating there, and any Palestinians approaching those areas, the army fires warning shots, and if they don't respond to those warning shots, then they are directly targeted. So in the past week, we've seen about every day there's 2 or 3 incidents like these where the army opens fire. And what we have seen as well a few times as well this past week is vehicles trying to travel from southern Gaza to northern Gaza. So under the terms of the agreement, vehicles can only travel via the Salah ad-Din road, which is in the sort of the middle of Gaza. And there's private contractors, Americans and Egyptians, who are inspecting vehicles heading north. And the Israeli army is basically enforcing this by any vehicle that is seen trying to travel to North Gaza, not via Salah ad-Din, but via another route, either via the coastal road or just via the fields in the middle. Then the Israeli Air Force has carried out airstrikes on these vehicles. So in the past week, there's been at least 3 or 4 cases like this, where the army has launched a drone strike as a warning shot, and if they continue driving, then they directly target the vehicle as well. But otherwise, relatively limited activity in Gaza, other than just enforcing the agreements that we're in, because of course we're in a ceasefire, so the army can't really do much else.
Okay, Defense Minister Yisrael Katz ordered IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Or Levy on Friday to reprimand the head of the Military Intelligence Directorate, Major General Shlomi Binder, after he reportedly warned during a military assessment meeting about potential security risks relating to U.S. President Trump's plan to take over the Gaza Strip and displace its population. So, honestly, Manny, when I first heard about the plan, my first thought was, what just happened? But after that, I would say that my first concern was that this would spark a large-scale third intifada that would be stemming from the West Bank. So it sounds like Binder had similar thoughts. And what are we hearing about this from the professional security institutions?
Right, so Binder had warned, I wouldn't even say warned, but it was during a closed military assessment. Only IDF officers, Katz wasn't involved in that. And he basically said during this assessment that the discourse on Trump's plan, the discussion in the Arab world and in the Palestinian community, especially in the West Bank, of course we know that Trump's plan has been rejected by most of the Palestinian population and the Arab world. But what Binder was saying is that the discourse surrounding the plan, plus the fact that we are about to enter the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, which is usually a relatively volatile time of year, this could spark violence or some sort of escalation. And he basically warned about this potential violence and the consequences of the plan, and he urged preparations for this scenario. Now, this military assessment wasn't something that the army publicly released or wasn't anything official, but it was reported by Israeli television, by Channel 13, and Katz saw this news report and decided that Binder had apparently opposed Trump's plan and decided that it was no good. Of course, Binder did not express any sentiment for or against the plan. I'll say separately that the army is willing to carry out whatever the plan entails. They don't have a choice in that regard. And Katz has been kind of maybe looking for a fight with the army recently, and he put out the statement saying that Or Levy needs to reprimand him for speaking against the important plan, as he called it. Of course, Binder then spoke to Katz afterwards and clarified to him that he was not against the plan or anything. He was just talking about the consequences, because that's his job as the chief of the intelligence directorate, is to make assessments and prepare the army for those scenarios. And if Katz wants to stop that and only hear things he wants to hear, then that's a huge problem for the country if that's how he's going to treat the intelligence chiefs and those who are supposed to prepare the army for those sort of scenarios. It's not the first time that Katz has been doing this sort of thing. My only guess is, and of course I'm not a political reporter, is that he's trying to do this to sort of gain some momentum and support to try and show that he's telling the army what to do and he's in charge and everything. But he's doing it in a way where he's sort of clashing with the army rather than trying to be in charge. And we saw this with Halevi a few times, with Katz ordering Halevi to do all sorts of things that don't really make much sense. And in this case as well, trying to tell the intelligence chief that a closed door meeting on intelligence assessments that he needs to be reprimanded for that. So it's a bit of a tricky situation that we're in right now. In about a month, we're getting a new IDF chief of staff. Hopefully they will get along a bit better.
So you were in the West Bank last week, embedded with IDF troops, I believe in Tulkarem. Give us a sense of what is going on the ground right now.
So the army has been in the midst of this very major West Bank operation. It began in Jenin, it expanded to Tulkarem, and also in the Tubas area, close to where the deadly shooting attack took place last week. It's sort of like the regular West Bank raids that we're used to, just lasting for much, much longer. So it's been going on for almost 3 weeks now. On Monday, it will be 3 weeks. And at the same time as this counterterrorism operation, it's important to note that it comes during the release of the Palestinian prisoners, many of them to the West Bank. So at the same time, the army is also paying visits to the families of the Palestinian prisoners that are being released to warn them against carrying out parades or celebrations in honor of their release. And also the army is detaining suspects who are thought to be involved in maybe planning a parade. So that's mainly where the focus is now. The army is still in Jenin, in the Jenin camp, which basically all of its residents have left there. So even the released prisoners are not returning to Jenin at this stage because the army is operating there. I think that this operation will last at least until the end of the ceasefire. The army wants to have a presence in these Palestinian cities and especially in the refugee camps, in order to prevent a violent uprising or even just parades during the release of the Palestinian prisoners. It's sort of, the army is showing that it is in charge of these areas and not the terror groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other smaller organizations in the Palestinian cities and refugee camps. And that's one of the main reasons why it's being carried out now and still being carried out, because this sort of operation could have been carried out at any time during the past year. The Hamas presence in the West Bank hasn't changed significantly in the past year. But it's being done now because of the hostage deal with Hamas.
And as we've been speaking, we just received an update that the Palestinian prisoner release has begun. Manny, I want to end with looking at Lebanon, and the Israeli Air Force carried out strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on Thursday night. This isn't the first time. It won't be the last. The ceasefire was extended until February 18th, another 10 days. Tell me, what do you suspect is happening in this strike, and what can be happening in the future to prevent this continued, I guess, weapon smuggling, essentially, is what's going on, right?
Right. I think even after the ceasefire officially ends on the 18th, and even if it continues into something permanent, we'll still see the army carry out strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. That is sort of what Israel has set for itself, is that they're not returning to what happened after 2006, which was once the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon began after the 2006 Second Lebanon War. Israel basically didn't target Lebanon at all, didn't touch Hezbollah, and allowed it to build itself up for nearly 20 years. Now we are in a ceasefire. On the February 18, the IDF will withdraw from South Lebanon if everything goes according to schedule. But airstrikes on Hezbollah assets and Hezbollah attempts to rebuild and weapon smugglings via Syria will continue. And this may result in Hezbollah responding. So far, we saw one case where Hezbollah fired a couple mortars over the border, but we haven't seen any other major responses by Hezbollah to Israeli strikes. And Israel has vowed to not allow Hezbollah to rebuild itself in Lebanon. As long as Hezbollah is not rebuilding, Israel won't strike in Lebanon. But if they do, then their assets, their weapon convoys, the border crossings will be targeted. I will add on top of that one more thing, that we have seen Syria, the new government in Syria, also step up with that regard. When the Assad regime was in power, that's how Hezbollah was getting most of its weapons. Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. Now with the new regime, or I guess the new government, they are very anti-Hezbollah. And we've seen Syrian authorities prevent smugglings to Lebanon several times. They've captured weapons and drones and missiles that were going to reach Hezbollah. And they've explicitly said that they were heading to Hezbollah as well. So that's good news for Israel, at least, that the new Syrian government is also working to prevent these weapons from reaching the Lebanese terror group.
I will take that optimism on this day of very mixed emotions as 3 additional Israeli hostages were released from their Gazan captivity of 491 days. Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Adina Karpuch. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.